A forgotten diary holds the last entry of a teen who disappeared in 2004. The dust was the first thing to hit him. Not the gentle dancing motes you see in a sunbeam, but a thick, choking ghost of 100 forgotten years. It smelled of rot and damp and the lonely death of wood. Mike swung the sledgehammer again, the impact shuddering up his arms, and a larger section of the wall gave way with a groan of splintering lath. This old house on the edge of town, the one slated for demolition to make way for a sterile new subdivision, didn't want to die quietly. It clung to its secrets with the tenacity of ivy. He was sweating through his shirt, the July heat pressing down like a physical weight. Another swing. The plaster exploded, and in the cavity behind it, something fell with a soft, dull thud. Not a rat, not a brick. It was a small, rectangular object wrapped in what looked like a faded floral pillowcase. Mike lowered the sledgehammer, curiosity cutting through his fatigue. He reached into the wall, his calloused fingers brushing away a century of grime and cobwebs, and pulled it out. He unwrapped the cloth. It was a diary. The cover was cheap, imitation leather, a dark burgundy color, now scuffed and warped by time and humidity. A small, tarnished brass lock held it shut, but the clasp had rusted through and crumbled at his touch. On the front, embossed in what was once gold foil, were 2 words: "My thoughts." He shouldn't have opened it. He knew that. It was a violation, a trespass on a life he had no right to witness. But the house was coming down tomorrow. Whatever this was, it would be rubble by noon. He told himself it was salvage, not snooping. He sat down on an overturned bucket, the air thick with the ghosts he'd just disturbed, and opened the book. The first page was a riot of bubbly, teenage script, written in a dozen different colors of gel pen. January 1st, 2004. New year, new me. Lowell, so cliché, I know. Resolutions. 1. Stop fighting with Mum about my low-rise jeans. They're not that low. 2. Get a B+ or higher in algebra. Mr. Davison is a troll. 3. Finally talk to Josh Michaels without turning the color of a tomato. 4. Write in this diary every single day. Let's see how long that lasts. A ghost of a smile touched Mike's lips. He remembered 2004. He'd been a young man himself, just out of high school, full of a different kind of angst. He flipped a few pages. The entries were a time capsule of a forgotten era. Burning CDs for friends, the agony of a dial-up modem disconnecting, the thrill of a new message on AIM from a crush. The girl's name was Lily. Lily Carter, she wrote, with a breathless, dramatic flair that made Mike's own quiet, solitary life feel grey by comparison. She wrote about her best friend Sarah, about sneaking out to see a movie, about the profound injustice of a 10 p.m. curfew. Her world was small, and bright and felt like the entire universe. Mike was a man who understood forgotten things. His own dreams had been bulldozed long ago, replaced by the grim reality of demolition work and lonely evenings in a small apartment. He felt a strange kinship with this girl, this voice trapped in the wall. He kept reading, losing track of time. As the sun bled through the skeletal frame of the house, the tone began to change around April. The bubbly script tightened, the colors of the gel pens narrowing down to a single nervous black. A new name appeared. April 12, 2004. Mum's friend, Mr. Sterling, came over for dinner again. He's so important. He's on the town council, and he's helping my dad with some business stuff. He always looks right at me when he talks, not like I'm a kid, but like I'm, I don't know, a grown-up. He told me I had hauntingly beautiful eyes. Mum was so flattered. I just felt weird. My stomach did this little flip, but it wasn't a good flip like with Josh, it was a cold flip. Mike paused. He knew a Mr. Sterling. Of course he did. Everyone in the small town of Northwood knew him. William Sterling, philanthropist, real estate developer, the man who practically owned the town council. He'd just built a massive, gleaming mansion on the hill overlooking this very property. A man universally respected, a pillar of the community. Mike's unease grew. He read on. May 3, 2004. I was walking home from Sarah's, and a car pulled up beside me. A big, black Mercedes. It was him, Mr. Sterling. He smiled and said, "A pretty girl like you shouldn't be walking alone." He offered me a ride. I didn't want to be rude, so I got in. The car smelled like leather and something else, something sweet and cloying. He put his hand on my knee. "Just for a second," he said. "Just making sure you're buckled in safe." Lily, but I was already buckled in. My whole leg felt like it was on fire and then frozen, both at the same time. I didn't say anything. What could I say? He's my dad's friend. I just stared out the window until he dropped me off. When I got out, he said, "Our little secret, okay?" Mike's knuckles were white where he gripped the diary. The air in the derelict house suddenly felt colder, heavier. The dust motes, swirling in the fading light, seemed to coalesce into watchful eyes. This wasn't just a diary, it was a confession. It was a scream that had been silenced by plaster and time. The entries became shorter, more frantic. The handwriting grew spidery, losing its confident loops. May 20th, 2004. He was at the house again. Mum and Dad went out to get a movie. He said he'd wait. He came upstairs. He said he wanted to see my room. He said he wanted to see my drawings. I have them pinned on the wall. He stood behind me, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. He pointed to one of my sketches and his fingers brushed against my shoulder, then went down my back. I froze. I felt like a stone. He whispered, "You're so talented, Lily. So much potential." His voice was thick. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I just stood there, smiling, like a stupid doll. He left before Mum and Dad got home. I tore the drawings off the wall after he was gone. I tore them into a million pieces. June 4th, 2004. He knows where I work. The little bookstore downtown. He came in today, bought a book. When he handed me the money, he folded his fingers over mine and held them there. His skin was dry and hot. He looked me right in the eyes and he didn't blink. It felt like he was branding me. Mrs. Gable, my boss, just thought he was being a charming customer. "Mr. Sterling is such a gentleman," she said after he left. A gentleman. I wanted to throw up. Mike felt a hot surge of rage. He knew Mrs. Gable. She was a sweet old woman who ran the bookstore until it closed down a decade ago. She wouldn't have seen the predator behind the polished smile. No one would have. That was his power. The perfect, unassailable gentleman. He flipped towards the end of the diary, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pages were sparse now. A few entries were just single, terrified sentences. June 15th, 2004. He drove past my house 4 times today. I counted. June 18th, 2004. He told my dad I was a special girl, a girl with a bright future. He said he wanted to be my mentor. My dad was so proud. June 21st, 2004. He said he has a gift for me. A surprise. He wants to give it to me tomorrow night. He said he'll come by when my parents are at their weekly dinner club. He knows their schedule. He knows everything. Mike's breath hitched. He knew what came next. He knew it with a sickening certainty that settled like lead in his gut. He turned the page. It was the last one with any writing on it. The page was stiff, stained with something. Dark near the bottom corner, the handwriting was a chaotic scrawl, the pen having dug into the paper so hard it had nearly torn through. It wasn't written in a neat, chronological entry. It was a desperate, panicked burst of words, crammed into the center of the page. He's here. Oh God, he's downstairs. I heard his car. I locked my door, but the lock is so old it's useless. He's not supposed to be here. He called my dad and said he was canceling their meeting tonight. A lie. It was all a lie. He's in the house. I can hear him. He's walking up the stairs. He's humming. That's the worst part. He's humming a little tune like he's happy. Like this is a happy thing. I'm in the closet. It's dark. I can smell my own stupid perfume, strawberry. So childish. I push the dresser in front of the closet door, but it's not heavy enough. He's going to find me. I can hear him in my room now. He's touching my things. I can hear the hangers scraping in my closet. No, wait, he's not in the closet. He's talking, he's on the phone. He's saying, everything is going according to plan. The parents are out. The girl is being difficult, but she'll be dealt with. No, no one will suspect a thing. She's a troubled kid, prone to running away. Everyone knows that. Oh God, he planned this. This isn't a surprise. This is an ending. My ending. He's off the phone. He's at the closet door. He's pushing the dresser. It's scraping against the floor. The sound is so loud. It's the sound of my whole life being scraped away. I'm writing this because no one will believe me. They'll believe him. He's Mr. Sterling. He's a gentleman, but he's not. He's a monster, and he's humming again. He's right outside the door. My name is Lily Carter. I am 17 years old, and I don't want to die. The ink ended there. A long, jagged smear, as if the pen had been violently ripped from the page, dragging across the paper in a final, silent scream. Mike stared at the last word, the last letter, the final, desperate slash of ink. He could feel it. He could feel the terror of that closet, the smell of strawberry perfume, the suffocating darkness. He could hear the scraping of the dresser, the sound of a monster humming on the other side of the door. The diary fell from his hands, landing softly in the thick dust. He shot to his feet, his heart a wild animal in his chest. He stumbled to the empty frame of a window, gasping for air that wasn't stale with death and secrets. He looked out, past the ravaged lawn and the dying trees, up the hill, and there it was. William Sterling's mansion. It wasn't just a house, it was a monument to success. Gleaming white walls, a roof of perfect slate tiles, and a huge panoramic window that glittered in the dying sun like a malevolent eye. A light was on in an upstairs room. A silhouette moved past the window. 20 years. 20 years that girl, Lily Carter, had been a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a faded missing poster in the back of a file cabinet. The official story was that she'd run away, a troubled teen from a broken home, they said. Mike remembered the whispers. He'd been a teenager himself. He'd half believed it, but the truth wasn't in a file cabinet. It was here. It had been here the whole time, buried in the wall of her own home, waiting. And the man who had put her there, the man who had scraped away her life, was right there. Not hiding, not living in fear, thriving, admired, untouchable. Mike's hands clenched into fists. His knuckles were raw, his breathing ragged. He looked from the diary lying in the dust to the gleaming mansion on the hill. The police had failed. Her parents, in their grief and denial, had failed her. The whole town had failed her. Now, the only two people on earth who knew the truth were a dead girl and a demolition worker standing in her tomb. He had a choice. He could take the diary to the police, to the same department that had written her off as a runaway. They would ask questions, file reports, and the diary would likely end up in an evidence locker, buried again under bureaucracy and the weight of William Sterling's influence. Or, he could do something else. The thought was a dangerous spark. In the tinderbox of his rage, the sun had set. The house was now completely dark, a hollowed-out skull. But the light in the mansion on the hill burned brighter than ever. It was a beacon of injustice, a monument to a crime that had gone unpunished for 2 decades. And as Mike stood there in the suffocating darkness, a cold, hard certainty crystallized in his soul. This wasn't over. He wouldn't let it be. He had unearthed the ghost, and now, that ghost was going to scream. The cliffhanger wasn't just a choice, it was a vow. He bent down and picked up the diary, its fragile pages holding the weight of a life. He tucked it carefully inside his jacket, the cheap imitation leather feeling like the most precious and terrible thing he had ever touched. He walked out of the house, not looking back. He didn't have to. The ghost of Lily Carter was coming. With him, Lily Carter was more than the bubbly script in the first few pages of her diary. She was a splinter of light in a house that was slowly dimming. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman perpetually chasing a version of happiness she saw in magazines. Life of garden parties and influential friends. She was brittle. Her smiles stretched thin over a foundation of disappointment. She saw William Sterling not as a man, but as an opportunity, a stepping stone into the world she so desperately wanted to inhabit. Lily's father, Tom, was a ghost. Long before his daughter became one, a decent man worn down by a failing contracting business, and a wife whose ambitions he could never quite satisfy. He was a man of quiet sighs and averted gazes, who saw the world through a haze of exhaustion. Their home, the one Mike was now demolishing, had been a stage for this quiet tragedy. The arguments were never shouted. They were hissed whispers behind closed doors, silences that stretched for days. Lily was their fragile truce, their shared project. They loved her, but their love was tangled in their own failures. For Eleanor, Lily was a beautiful accessory, a daughter whose accomplishments she could wear like a string of pearls. For Tom, she was a reminder of a simpler, happier time, a light he was terrified of losing. Lily navigated this emotional minefield with a resilience she didn't know she had. She was the family diplomat, the buffer, the sunbeam that insisted on breaking through the clouds. Her drawings weren't just a hobby, they were an escape. She sketched worlds where colors were brighter, where people didn't have shadows in their eyes. She drew fantastical creatures and sprawling, impossible cities. Her art was her secret language, the only place she could be truly honest. Her best friend Sarah was her anchor. Sarah was the opposite of Lily, cynical, sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal. She saw the cracks in the Carter family's facade. She was the one who rolled her eyes when Eleanor gushed about Mr. Sterling, the one who said, "That guy gives me the creeps." Long before Lily could even articulate her own fear, their friendship was forged in the crucible of small-town boredom, late-night bike rides, sharing a single pair of headphones to listen to a new album, whispering secrets in the dark of Sarah's attic bedroom. It was in that attic, a week before she disappeared, that Lily finally confessed her terror. "He won't leave me alone." "Sir," she'd whispered, her voice trembling. The only light was a string of fairy lights Sarah had tacked to the rafters. "He's everywhere. At the store, at my house. He just looks at me." Sarah sat up, her usual sarcasm gone, replaced by a cold fury. "What do you mean, looks?" "At you, like I'm a thing he wants to own." Lily hugged her knees to her chest. "He touches my arm, my back. He says it's just being friendly, but it feels dirty, and the worst part is, my mum loves him. She thinks he's going to help Dad get a big contract. She thinks he's our savior. He's not a savior, Lil. He's a creep," Sarah said, her voice hard. "You have to tell your parents. You have to tell them what he's doing." "I can't." Lily's voice broke. "You don't understand. If I do, Dad might lose the contract. Mum will. She'll say I'm being dramatic. She'll say I'm ruining everything. She'll choose him over me. I know she will." The words hung in the air, a truth so terrible she had never dared to speak it aloud before. The betrayal wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. That was Lily, trapped not just by a predator, but by the fragile, desperate web of her own family. Her disappearance wasn't a mystery to Sarah. It was the horrifying, logical conclusion to a story she had watched unfold with a growing sense of dread. When the police had questioned her, a scared, heartbroken 17-year-old, she had told them everything. She'd told them about Mr. Sterling, about Lily's fear, about our little secret car ride. The detective, a man named Miller, had listened with a patient, dismissive air. He was overweight, weary, a man who had seen too many teenage dramas. He'd known William Sterling for years. They played golf together at the country club. "Kids have active imaginations, Sarah," he'd said, his voice patronizing. Lily was under a lot of stress. Her parents said she'd been moody, withdrawn. It's a classic runaway profile. He had taken her statement, filed it away, and focused on the easier narrative. The troubled girl, the open road, the tragic, but simple, explanation. Sarah's words, the truth, had been dismissed as the hysterical ramblings of a grieving friend. The injustice had planted a seed of bitter rage in her that had been growing. For 20 years, William Sterling, the antagonist, was a man sculpted from ambition and emptiness. He hadn't been born into wealth. He'd clawed his way to it with a chilling blend of charm and ruthlessness. His past was a carefully curated fiction. He told people he'd come from a modest, hard-working family. The truth was far darker. His father had been a violent alcoholic, his mother a terrified wraith who had vanished when he was 10. He'd spent his teenage years in a series of foster homes, each one a lesson in manipulation and survival. He learned early on that the world responded to the illusion of power. He learned to mimic the speech of the wealthy, to wear sincerity. Like a well-tailored suit, his cruelty wasn't born of passion. It was a tool. He saw people as objects, as assets or liabilities. Women, in particular, were things to be acquired, used, and discarded. He was drawn to Lily not just for her youth and beauty, but for her vulnerability. It was the same vulnerability he'd seen in his own mother, and it triggered in him a terrifying cocktail of desire and contempt. He wanted to possess her light, and then he wanted to extinguish it. It was a pattern he had repeated before, in other towns, under other names, always managing to stay one step ahead of the whispers, always burying his secrets before they could take root. In Northwood, he had finally built his fortress. He'd married a woman from a wealthy family, a timid, fragile woman who was too scared of him to ever question his late nights or his cold moods. He'd embedded himself in the town's power, structure his donations to the police department and the town council buying him loyalty and silence. He saw the Carters as pawns. Tom's desperation for work was a lever he could pull. Eleanor's social climbing was a weakness he could exploit, and Lily was the prize. He groomed them all with the patience of a spider, spinning a web of obligation and trust around them until they were completely entangled. He convinced them he was their benefactor, their friend. All while he was stalking their daughter. The hidden witness was Mike. Not just Mike, the demolition worker, but Mike whose own past was a landscape of loss. His younger sister Jessica had died in a hit-and-run when he was 19. She'd been 15. The driver was drunk, the son of a wealthy family from the next town over. The boy had gotten a slap on the wrist, a year of probation. Mike had watched his parents crumble, had felt the searing, helpless rage of injustice. He had seen firsthand how money and influence could bend the law, how a life could be erased and forgotten by everyone, except those who loved it. The incident had shattered him. He'd dropped out of community college, drifted from job to job. The anger, a low-grade fever that never broke. He kept to himself, building a wall around his own heart. Demolishing houses was a fitting profession. He was good at tearing things down. It was easier than building anything. Finding Lily's diary wasn't an accident, it was a collision of fates. The story in those faded pages wasn't just Lily's, it was Jessica's. It was the story of every girl who had been silenced, every victim whose truth had been buried. The power imbalance, the casual cruelty of the powerful. The dismissive shrug of the lot was a narrative he knew in his bones. That first night, after leaving the Carter house, Mike didn't go home. He drove to the 24-hour diner on the highway, the diary sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. He ordered black coffee and sat in a booth, the cracked red vinyl cold against his back. He read the diary again, from start to finish. This time, he wasn't just a discoverer. He was an investigator. He absorbed every detail, every nuance, every flicker of fear in Lily's words. He saw the pattern. The slow, deliberate escalation, the way Sterling had isolated her, tested her boundaries, made her complicit in her own violation through silence. He saw the calculated cruelty of it all. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a hunt. A waitress refilled his cup. "Rough night?" she asked, her eyes kind. Mike just nodded, unable to speak. He pushed a few dollars under his cup and left. He drove to the public library in the next town over, waited for it to open at 9 a.m., and used their computers to search the archives of the Northwood Chronicle. He found the articles about Lily's disappearance. They were small, buried in the back pages after the first week, Local teen feared runaway parents plead for daughter's return. The articles quoted Detective Miller. They mentioned Lily's history of moodiness. They painted the exact picture Sterling had predicted they would. He found one small, brave article, a letter to the editor from Sarah. It was a furious, desperate plea. Lily Carter did not run away. She was scared. She was being stalked by a powerful man in this town, and no one listened. Look closer. Please, look closer. The letter was followed by a short editor's note. The Northwood Chronicle does not endorse unsubstantiated allegations. The door had been slammed in her face. He then searched for William Sterling. He found dozens of articles. Sterling pledges new wing for hospital. Sterling honored as Man of the Year. Sterling development to revitalize downtown. His face was everywhere, smiling, confident, benevolent. The man in the photos was the same man from Lily's nightmares, but to the world, he was a saint. The injustice was a physical thing, a sickness in his stomach. He felt a kinship with Sarah, the friend who had screamed the truth into a void and been ignored. He wondered where she was now. Did she still live in Northwood? Did she still carry that rage? He knew he couldn't go to the police, not yet. They had failed Lily once. They would fail her again. Sterling was too insulated, too powerful. A 20-year-old diary found by a demolition worker. Sterling's hyperist lawyers would tear it apart. They would paint Mike as an opportunist, a crank. They would paint Lily all over again, as a troubled, imaginative girl. No, the system wouldn't work. The system was broken. It was designed to protect men like Sterling. He needed more than the diary. He needed to find the friend. He needed to find Sarah. She was the other half of the story, the living witness. Her voice, combined with Lily's, might be loud enough to finally break through the silence. He packed the diary away, a new resolve hardening inside him. He was no longer just a man who tore down buildings. He was going to build something. He was going to build a case, brick by painful brick. He was going to build a pyre for William Sterling, and Lily's diary would be the kindling. His own cold, quiet life was over. He had a purpose now. He had to find Sarah. He had to give a ghost her voice back. And he had to make a monster pay. The rage that had simmered inside him since his sister's death now had a focus. It was a cold, clear, and terrifying thing. He finally felt like he was building something again, but what he was building was a reckoning. Finding Sarah wasn't hard. A few more hours of online searches, cross-referencing old high school yearbooks with social media, led him to her. Sarah Connolly. Now, she was a high school art teacher in a town 3 counties over. She had left Northwood the day she graduated and had never looked back. Her profile picture showed a woman with the same defiant eyes from the yearbook photo, now framed by lines of cynicism and a sadness that Mike recognized instantly. He found her email address on the school's staff directory. His hands trembled as he wrote the email. He kept it short, cryptic. Subject: Lily Carter. My name is Mike. I think I found something you need to see. It's about what happened in 2004. I believe you. He hit send and felt a jolt, as if he'd just lit a fuse. The reply came less than an hour later. It was just an address and a time. Tonight, 7 p.m., Sarah lived in a small, cluttered house that smelled of turpentine and clay. Canvases were stacked against every wall, most of them dark, abstract, and turbulent. They looked like the inside of a storm. When she opened the door, she looked him up and down with a guarded, almost hostile suspicion. "You're Mike," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He held out the plastic-wrapped diary. "This is for you." She took it from him. Her eyes fixed on the familiar burgundy cover. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She held it to her chest, her knuckles turning white. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In a wall. In her old house. They're tearing it down." She finally looked at him, and for the first time, the wall of hostility cracked. He saw the 17-year-old girl underneath, the one who had lost her best friend and had her truth thrown back in her face. "Come in," she said. They sat in her kitchen, a single bare bulb hanging over the table. Sarah read the diary. Mike watched as 20 years of carefully constructed scar tissue was ripped away. She didn't sob. Her grief was a silent, violent storm, her shoulders shaking, her face a mask of anguish and fury. When she got to the last, frantic entry, a choked guttural sound escaped her lips. She closed the book, her hand flat on the cover, as if she could protect the girl inside. "I told them," she whispered, the words raw. "I told the police everything. I told them he was a monster. They didn't listen. They made me feel like I was crazy." "I know," Mike said softly. "I read your letter in the paper. I believe you, Sarah. I always would have." That was the beginning of their alliance. A grim partnership forged in shared rage. Sarah's fury, which had been a smoldering ember for 2 decades, was fanned into a blaze by the diarist's reappearance. She was no longer a scared teenager. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. Their first move was to go back to the police. Not in Northwood. They went to the state police, hoping for a fresh set of eyes. An investigator who wasn't on payroll. They were assigned to a Detective Harding, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp, intelligent face and a reputation for being thorough. They sat in a sterile interrogation room as Harding read the diary, her expression unreadable. She listened patiently as Sarah recounted her story, her voice gaining strength and clarity with every word. She listened as Mike explained how he'd found the book. "It's a compelling narrative," Harding said, closing the diary and placing it carefully in an evidence bag. "But it's not enough." "Not enough." Sarah's voice rose. "It's a confession." She names him. She describes her own murder. She describes her fear, Harding corrected gently. "The last entry is terrifying, but it doesn't explicitly state he killed her. There's no body. There's no physical evidence tying him to her disappearance. A good lawyer and Sterling can afford the best will say this is the fantasy of a troubled girl. They'll say she ran away, just like everyone believed, and died somewhere else, sometime later. I'm sorry, my hands are tied until we have more." The injustice was a slap in the face. It was 2004 all over again, just with a more polite, sympathetic tone. They left the station feeling defeated, the old familiar helplessness washing over them. But Sterling heard about their visit. May have been professional, but police departments have long ears. A friendly call from the Northwood chief to his old friend, Detective Miller. A casual mention to a golf buddy at the country club, the word got back to him. And the antagonist, feeling the first tremor of a threat to his perfect world, began to move. The cruelty was no longer just a memory in a diary. It became brutally real. A few days after their visit to the state police, Mike was fired from his job. No reason given. His boss, a man he'd worked with for 6 years, wouldn't even look him in the eye. "It's just a workforce reduction, Mike. Sorry, but Mike knew." Sterling was showing him his reach. Then came Sarah. A formal complaint was filed with her school board. An anonymous letter, claiming she was an unstable influence on her students. That she was obsessed with a delusional conspiracy theory and was creating an unsafe learning environment. Her principal, a weak-willed man, terrified of controversy, put her on administrative leave, pending an investigation. "He's trying to silence us," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage over the phone. "He's trying to discredit us before we can even start. He was isolating them, just as he had isolated Lily. He was turning their lives upside down, using his power to paint them as the villains, the unstable ones." The humiliation was a constant grinding pressure. Mike's former co-workers crossed the street to avoid him. Sarah's neighbors started looking at her with suspicion. The fear was a constant companion. Mike would see black Mercedes cars everywhere, his heart leaping into his throat before he realized it was just a random vehicle. He started sleeping with a baseball bat by his bed. Sarah found one of her tires slashed. There were no threats, no direct confrontations. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make them feel powerless and paranoid. Mike felt himself being pulled back into the vortex of anger that had consumed him after his sister's death. But this time was different. He wasn't alone. He had Sarah, and they had Lily's voice. He's making a mistake. Mike said to Sarah one night, their strategy sessions now held in hushed tones in her dimly lit kitchen. He's getting sloppy. He's reacting. That means he's scared. What good is that if he ruins our lives in the process? Sarah shot back, gesturing around her house, which now felt more like a prison than a home. It's good because it means we're on the right track, Mike insisted, his voice low and intense. We can't fight him on his turf. We can't win with money or power. We have to find a crack in his fortress. Something he's forgotten. Something he thinks is buried forever. The witness, Mike, struggled between his own fear and his conscience. There were moments he wanted to walk away. He could take the diary, burn it, and go back to his quiet, empty life. The weight of Lily's memory was immense, and the danger was real. He saw the toll it was taking on Sarah, the way the light in her eyes was dimming again, replaced by a haunted look. Was he right to drag her back into this nightmare? Was his quest for justice just another form of destruction? One evening, he drove to the cemetery where his sister was buried. He stood before the simple granite headstone. Jessica Miller, beloved daughter and sister. He'd failed to get justice for her. He had let his anger consume him and then fade into a dull ache of resignation. He wouldn't let that happen again. Lily's ghost was his second chance. His conscience wouldn't let him quit. He wasn't just fighting for Lily anymore. He was fighting for Jessica, for himself, for every person who had ever been silenced by a powerful man in a nice suit. He went back to Sarah's house that night with a new resolve. We need to go back to the beginning, he said, spreading a map of Northwood on her kitchen table. We need to walk in Lily's footsteps. We need to think like he thought. They spent the next week obsessively retracing the last months of Lily's life. They went to the old bookstore, now a vape shop. They drove past the Carter house, now a bulldozed lot of dirt and debris. They visited the high school. They were chasing ghosts, searching for an echo, a memory, anything. The escalating conflict came to a head one rainy afternoon. They were sitting in Mike's truck across the street from the Northwood Country Club, where Sterling was hosting a charity golf tournament. They were watching the town's elite laugh and shake hands with a monster, and the sheer maddening injustice of it was a poison in their veins. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. That's him. That's Detective Miller. Mike followed her gaze. The detective who had dismissed Sarah's story 20 years ago was walking towards Sterling, a big, sycophantic grin on his face. They shook hands. Sterling clapped him on the back. They looked like the best of friends. He was in on it, Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. He wasn't just lazy or dismissive, he was protecting him. The betrayal was a fresh wound, deep and septic. The very person who was supposed to protect Lily had been an accomplice. The system wasn't just broken, it was corrupt to its core. As they watched, Sterling looked up, his eyes scanning the street. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to lock directly onto Mike's truck. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of ownership, of complete and utter confidence. It was a smile that said, I see you. I know what you're doing, and you can't touch me. He then turned his back on them and walked into the clubhouse. The king in his castle. That was the moment the last of their fear burned away, replaced by a cold, hard diamond of pure rage. The conflict had escalated from a quiet investigation to a direct confrontation. Even if it was one conducted across a rain-streaked street, Sterling had acknowledged them. He had challenged them, and they were not going to back down. They were no longer just seeking justice, they were seeking vengeance. The stakes had been raised, and the game had become infinitely more dangerous. The smile, that cold, confident smile from across the street, was a declaration of war. It was also a mistake. It was the arrogance of a predator who had never been challenged, who believed his fortress was impenetrable. But in showing his hand, in acknowledging them, Sterling had inadvertently given Mike and Sarah a new direction. He had confirmed the conspiracy. It wasn't just him, it was Miller. It was the system. He's not just confident, he's sloppy, Mike said, His eyes narrowed. His hands gripping the steering wheel. He thinks we're still those scared kids from 20 years ago. He thinks he can intimidate us and we'll just crawl away. So what do we do? Sarah asked, the fire back in her voice. We can't go to the cops. We can't go to the press. We have nothing but a dead girl's diary and a corrupt cop's handshake. We go deeper, Mike said. We don't look for Lily anymore. We look for him. We dig into Sterling's life. We dig into Miller's. We find out where all the other bodies are buried. Because there's no way Lily was the first. Men like him don't just start at 17. Their investigation pivoted. It became a forensic accounting of two men's lives. They spent their days in library archives, poring over microfiche of old newspapers from the towns Sterling had lived in before Northwood. They spent their nights online, falling down rabbit holes of public records, property deeds, and old business filings. It was a painstaking, soul-crushing process. They were looking for a pattern, a whisper, another girl who had been troubled, another disappearance that had been too quickly dismissed. The plot twist didn't come from a dramatic, unearthed clue. It came from a moment of quiet, desperate inspiration. They were at Sarah's kitchen table, surrounded by piles of paper, the air stale with coffee and frustration. Sarah was staring at a photo of the Carter house she had taken years ago, a nostalgic snapshot from a happier time. In the background, partially obscured by a rosebush, was the house next door. Old Man Hemlock's place, Sarah said, her voice distant. He was a recluse, a bit of a town weirdo. He had cameras all over his property. Said he was protecting himself from government spies. Mike leaned in, his heart starting to beat faster. Cameras? What kind of cameras? Old ones, big, clunky things. This was 2004. He had them pointed at the street, at his yard, at everything. Everyone thought he was nuts. Where is he now? Mike asked, a frantic energy seizing him. He died about 10 years ago. House was sold, torn down, one of Sterling's developments, actually a set of The hope deflated as quickly as it had appeared. So the cameras are gone, the tapes, everything. It's a dead end. Maybe not, Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with a sudden, fierce intelligence. Hemlock was a paranoid hoarder. He never threw anything away. When he died, his estranged nephew had to clean out the house. It took months. He held the world's biggest, weirdest estate sale. People talked about it for years. He sold everything from antique furniture to boxes and boxes of junk. The spark was back. Boxes of junk, Mike repeated, the words hanging in the air. What kind of junk? Anything, everything. Old magazines, broken radios, and tapes. Boxes of VHS tapes. He was obsessed with recording old TV shows. It was the longest of long shots, a desperate gamble based on a half-remembered piece of town gossip. But it was the only lead they had. For the next week, they became detectives of a different kind, tracking down people who had attended the Hemlock estate sale a decade earlier. They posted on local community forums, they called antique dealers. They put up flyers in neighboring towns, seeking VHS tapes purchased from the Hemlock estate sale. Most people didn't respond. A few who did had already taped over the old recordings. The trail was cold, the hope dwindling with every failed call. They were about to give up when Mike got an email. It was from a man named George, a collector of obscure media. I bought about 50 tapes at that sale, the email read. Mostly old sci-fi shows. They've been in my basement ever since. You're welcome to look through them if you want, but I can't imagine what you'd be looking for. George lived 2 hours away, in a house filled with towers of dusty electronics and shelves of neatly labeled videotapes. He led them to his basement, a concrete room that smelled of damp earth and ozone. He pointed to a stack of cardboard boxes. In the corner, there you go, knock yourselves out. It was a needle in a haystack. For hours, Mike and Sarah sat on the cold concrete floor, sifting through the tapes. The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, Star Trek. Most were labeled in Hemlock's spidery script. A few were just marked with dates. They set up a small TV VCR combo George had given them and started feeding the tapes. One by one, they watched hours of grainy black and white television, the hope draining away with each press of the eject button. They were on the last box, their spirits at their lowest, when Sarah pulled out a tape with a single, hastily scrawled label, June 22, 2004. Exterior, their eyes met. It was the date, the night Lily disappeared. Mike's hand was shaking so badly he could barely get the tape into the VCR. He pressed play. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a TV show. It was the view from a security camera, static and timestamped in the bottom corner. The camera was positioned high, looking down on the street between Hemlock's house and the Carters. The quality was poor. The image washed out under a security light, but it was clear enough. They watched, their breath held. For the first hour, nothing happened, just an empty, silent street. Then, at 9:15 p.m., a car pulled up in front of the Carter house, a big, black Mercedes. The same one from Lily's diary. A man got out. Even in the grainy footage, his confident posture was unmistakable. It was William Sterling. He walked up to the front door and let himself in. He had a key, Sarah whispered, her voice horrified. They kept watching, their hearts pounding. The minutes ticked by, an agonizing crawl. The house remained dark and silent. Then, at 10:32 p.m., the front door opened again. It wasn't just Sterling. He was dragging something. No, not something. Someone. A girl. She was limp, her feet dragging. On the ground, her long dark hair obscured her face, but they knew. It was Lily. She was either unconscious or, worse. Sterling pulled her across the lawn, his movements quick and efficient, like a man taking out the trash. He opened the trunk of the Mercedes. He bundled her inside, his body blocking the camera's view for a moment, and then slammed it shut. A wave of nausea washed over Mike. He felt Sarah grab his arm, her nails digging into his skin. They were witnessing a murder. They were watching a ghost being made. Sterling got back in the car. But before he drove away, he paused. He looked around, his gaze sweeping the darkened houses. He looked directly up at where the camera would have been. He couldn't have known it was there, not for sure. But it was the same look he'd given them at the country club. A look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He then put the car in gear and drove away, disappearing down the silent street. The tape kept rolling, showing an empty street for another hour before it cut to static silence. The only sound in the basement was the quiet hum of the VCR. Sarah was openly weeping now, not for the friend she'd lost, but for the girl she had just watched being stolen, her body treated like a piece of garbage. Mike felt a cold, clean rage that burned away all his fear, all his doubt. This was it, the hidden clue, the irrefutable proof. This wasn't a diary entry that could be dismissed as fantasy. This was a moving picture. This was the truth. Grainy and undeniable, the full conspiracy was suddenly clear. Sterling hadn't just groomed Lily. He'd groomed the entire town. He'd groomed her parents into trusting him, the police into protecting him, the community into adoring him. He'd created the perfect hunting ground. The phone call Lily had overheard from the closet. Everything is going according to plan. She's a troubled kid, prone to running away, wasn't just a lie to an unknown accomplice. It was the narrative he had been carefully seeding for months. He hadn't just killed a girl. He had erased her, rewriting her life story to fit his crime. The stakes shifted instantly. This was no longer about personal pain or getting justice for one girl. This was about exposing a monster who was the beating heart of a town. This was about tearing down a corrupt system that had enabled him. This was a public scandal of the highest order, and they were holding the detonator. They thanked a stunned George who refused any payment for the tape, his face pale with shock at what he'd had in his basement for a decade. They drove back to Sarah's house in a state of electrified shock, the tape on the seat between them. The tension was at its absolute maximum. They had the weapon. Now they had to decide how to use it. Going back to Detective Harding was an option, but a risky one. What if she was part of it, too? What if she buried the tape, just as Miller had buried Sarah's testimony? The system had failed them at every turn. They couldn't trust it now. "We can't give this to them," Sarah said, her voice hard as steel. "They don't deserve to be the heroes of this story. They were the villains." "So what do we do?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. He could see it in her eyes. "We don't go to the police," she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. It was the same kind of smile Sterling had given them, but hers was righteous. "We go public, we go nuclear. We don't just expose him, we burn his entire world to the ground." The plan began to form, audacious and terrifying. The annual Northwood Founders Day Gala was in 3 days. It was the biggest social event of the year, hosted by the town council. And the keynote speaker, the man who would be honored for his endless contributions to the community, was William Sterling. He would be on a stage, in front of everyone. The press would be there. The whole town would be watching. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. The Northwood Grand Ballroom was a symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the town's elite. The women in their jewel-toned gowns, the men in their stuffy tuxedos. It was a monument to self-congratulation. On the dais at the front of the room, a large screen was set up for the evening's presentation. At the center of the head table sat William Sterling, soaking in the adoration like a Roman emperor. He was the picture of civic virtue, his smile practiced, his eyes sweeping the room with a look of benign ownership. He was untouchable. No one noticed the 2 figures slipping into the back of the room, Mike, looking awkward and out of place, in a borrowed suit, and Sarah, wearing a simple black dress that made her look like an avenging angel. They looked like catering staff, invisible. And no one, especially not the pimply teenage AV tech, hunched over a laptop near the stage, noticed when Mike distracted him with a question about the nearest exit while Sarah, her movements swift and sure, slipped a small USB drive into an open port on his computer. A few clicks, a file transfer, and it was done. She palmed the drive and faded back into the shadows with Mike, their hearts hammering in unison. The mayor, a portly man with a booming voice, was at the podium, beginning his gushing introduction of the man of the hour. "And now, it is my distinct honor to present a man who is more than just a successful businessman. He is a philanthropist, a leader, a friend. He is the very soul of Northwood. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Sterling." A wave of thunderous applause swept the room. Sterling stood up, basking in it, his arms raised in a gesture of humble gratitude. He walked to the podium, the spotlight following him. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the silent, expectant room. "Thank you, Mayor," he began, his voice smooth as velvet. "Thank you, my friends. I am truly humbled. When I first came to this town, I saw a community with a heart of gold. I only ever wanted to help that heart beat a little stronger." As he spoke, Sarah clutched Mike's arm. "Now," she whispered. Mike nodded to the back of the room, where a third member of their conspiracy, George, the quiet, unassuming tape collector, now a willing accomplice with a fire in his eyes, was standing by the ballroom's main control panel. George gave a slight nod and pressed a single button. The lights in the ballroom didn't go out. They all snapped on, full, harsh and unforgiving, killing the intimate, staged atmosphere. Every face was suddenly washed in a sterile, interrogative glare. At the same time, the large screen behind Sterling flickered, the town seal vanished, replaced by the grainy black and white image of a quiet suburban street. Sterling faltered, his words catching in his throat. He glanced behind him at the screen, a flicker of confusion on his face. The audience murmured, confused. On the screen, the timestamp read, June 22, 2004, 9:15 p.m. A black Mercedes pulled into frame. A collective gasp went through the room. Sterling froze, the blood drained from his face. His carefully constructed mask of benevolence began to crack, revealing the monster beneath. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with a dawning animal terror. The grainy figure of Sterling got out of the car and let himself into the Carter house. The room was silent now, the only sound, the faint hum of the projector. Every eye was glued to the screen, watching the ghost story they had all ignored for 20 years play out in horrifying detail. "What is this?" Sterling stammered into the microphone, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. "Turn it off. Someone turn this off." But no one moved. The AV tech was staring, paralyzed. The mayor looked on, his jaw slack. They were all transfixed. They watched the silent, agonizing passage of time. They watched the front door open again. They watched Sterling drag Lily's limp body across the lawn. A woman in the front row screamed, a raw piercing sound that broke the spell of silence. Others began to cry out, sounds of horror and disbelief. Detective Miller, now the chief of police, was on his feet, his face ashen. "Shut it down," he bellowed, but his voice was lost in the growing chaos. On the screen, Sterling bundled Lily's body into the trunk of his car and slammed it shut. He paused, looking around, his arrogant gaze sweeping across the dark houses before he drove away. The screen went to black, but it wasn't over. A moment later, a new image appeared, the last page of Lily's diary. The frantic, desperate scrawl magnified for all to see. "My name is Lily Carter. I am 17 years old. And I don't want to Desira's voice, amplified by the ballroom's sound system, suddenly filled the room. She and Mike had moved to the side, and she was speaking into a wireless microphone she'd taken from the AV table. Her voice was clear, cold, and ringing with the authority of absolute truth. "He didn't just kill her," she said, her words cutting through the pandemonium. "He killed her reputation. He and his friends in the police department called her a runaway. They called her troubled. They silenced her, and they silenced me. All eyes turned to her. She was no longer an invisible shadow. She was a fury, her face illuminated by the light from the screen. For 20 years, William Sterling has been living a lie, built on the grave of a 17-year-old girl he murdered in cold blood. He is not the soul of this town. He is its cancer." Sterling was cornered, a rat in a trap. His face was a grotesque mask of rage and fear. He lunged for the side of the stage, trying to escape, but 2 state police officers were suddenly there, blocking his path. Detective Harding stepped forward, her face grim. She hadn't trusted them with the tape, but they had forced her hand, and now she was here to finish it. "William Sterling." Harding's voice was calm but carried the weight of the law. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lily Carter." As the officers moved in, Sterling let out a primal roar of denial. He shoved one of them aside, his eyes wild, and scrambled off the stage, trying to lose himself in the panicked crowd. But the crowd wasn't helping him. They were recoiling from him, their faces filled with disgust and horror. They were looking at him for what he was, for the first time. The public exposure was absolute. The cameras from the local news stations, there to capture a feel-good community event, were now capturing the dramatic, live-and-air downfall of a monster. The flashes were like lightning, freezing the scene in a series of shocking tableaus. Sterling, his tuxedo askew, his face contorted in a snarl. Miller, the police chief, trying to shrink into the background, his face pale with guilt. The horrified faces of the townspeople, their illusions shattered. Mike watched it all unfold. A strange, calm detachment settling over him. He had done it. He had given the ghost her voice, and her scream was tearing down the temple. He saw Sarah, her face wet with tears, but her eyes blazing with a triumphant fire. The officers tackled Sterling before he reached the ballroom doors, wrestling him to the marble floor amidst the overturned chairs and shattered champagne glasses. As they cuffed him, his eyes found Mike and Sarah in the crowd. The look in them was no longer arrogant. It was pure, distilled hatred. A promise of retribution. But the promise was empty. He was broken. Harding's officers were moving through the crowd, heading straight for Chief Miller, who stood frozen in place, his face a mask of utter ruin. The conspiracy was unraveling in real time, on camera, for the entire world to see. The cinematic payoff was not just an arrest. It was an exorcism. The town's demon was being dragged, kicking and screaming. Into the light, the room was a cacophony of shouting reporters, crying guests, and police radios. Mike and Sarah stood together in the eye of the storm, the noise fading into a dull roar. It was over. The silence of 20 years had been broken by a sound so loud it would echo for decades. The viral moment was here, more explosive and cathartic than they could have ever imagined. Lily Carter was no longer a forgotten runaway. Her name was on everyone's lips. Her story was finally being told. And her ending, at long last, had become a beginning for justice. The explosion of the gala was followed by a deafening silence. The scandal didn't just break the internet, it shattered the community of Northwood. The headlines were relentless. The story of the philanthropist, playing on a loop on national news. The town that had prided itself on its quiet decency was now infamous. A case study in collective denial. William Sterling's trial was a formality. The videotape was undeniable. His high-priced lawyers could do nothing against the grainy, silent footage of him loading a girl's body into his trunk. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed a flicker of remorse, his face a stone mask of contempt throughout the proceedings. The last time Sarah and Mike saw him, he was being led from the courtroom in chains, a shell of a man. His empire of lies reduced to a six-bed cell. Chief Miller was also convicted of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact. His fall was, in some ways, even more pathetic. He wept on the stand, a broken man confessing how Sterling's money and influence had bought his silence 20 years ago. He was a symbol of the town's quiet corruption, the rot that had allowed the cancer to grow. For Mike and Sarah, the aftermath was a strange, hollow landscape. The rage that had fueled them for months was gone, its purpose served. In its place was a profound exhaustion, the emotional equivalent of a battlefield after the war. They had won. Justice had been served. But the victory felt bittersweet. With the metallic taste of grief, they didn't stay in Northwood. There was nothing for them there but ghosts and painful memories. Sarah sold her house and accepted a teaching position in a different state, a place where no one knew her name or the story that was now attached to it. Mike took the money he'd earned from the demolition job and simply drove, with no destination in mind. A year after the trial, they met again. It was Sarah's idea. She asked him to meet her back in Northwood, at the site of the old Carter house. The subdivision had been built, but the lot where Lily's house once stood remained empty. The scandal had tainted the property. No one wanted to build a home on a place so saturated with tragedy. It had become an unofficial memorial, a patch of wild grass and wildflowers in the midst of manicured lawns. Mike found Sarah standing in the center of the lot, looking at a small, simple granite marker that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a grave. Lily's remains were never found, despite Sterling's eventual grudging confession that he had buried her in the foundation of one of his early construction projects. A place now covered by a sprawling shopping mall. The marker was just that, a marker. A place for a name that had been lost for too long. Lily Carter 198720004. Her voice was finally heard. The stone had been placed there by Lily's parents. After the trial, after the undeniable truth had been laid bare, they had finally broken. The guilt had consumed them. Eleanor for her blind ambition, Tom for his willful ignorance. They had sold their new home, left Northwood, and issued a public apology to Sarah, acknowledging that she had been right all along and they had been unforgivably wrong. It was they who had paid for the marker, a final, inadequate act of penance. Mike and Sarah stood before the stone in silence for a long time. The wind rustled the tall grass. It was a peaceful sound. "Do you ever think about her?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice soft. The real her. Not the victim, not the ghost in the diary. The girl who loved strawberry perfume and drew impossible cities all the time, Mike said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I knew her." "Me too," Sarah said, a sad smile touching her lips. "Sometimes I feel guilty. We won, we got him, but it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't erase what he did." No, Mike agreed. It doesn't, but it matters, Sarah, what we did. It matters that the world knows the truth. It matters that he's in a cage. It matters that she has her name back. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the diary. It was worn, the pages soft as cloth. He had kept it all this time, a sacred text. He hadn't given it to the police as evidence. They had the tape, they didn't need it. He felt it belonged to Lily, and, by extension, to them. This belongs here, he said, kneeling down. He dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the granite marker. He placed the diary inside, the burgundy cover facing up. It felt like a burial, a final laying to rest, not of a body, but of a story. The last entry had been read. The book could finally be closed. They covered it with dirt, their hands brushing against each other. The shared act was a final, unspoken acknowledgement of the bond they had forged, a bond of grief and rage, and, finally, a hard-won peace. They left the lot together, walking away from the empty space and the buried diary. They didn't know if they would see each other again. Their shared war was over, and they were two different people, soldiers returning to a world that no longer felt like home. But they had given each other something precious, the belief that one person, one voice, could make a difference. Mike got back in his truck, and Sarah got in her car. Before he drove away, he looked back at the granite marker one last time. A group of teenagers were walking by, and one of them, a girl with long dark hair, paused to read the inscription. She placed a single, wild daisy she had picked from the grass at the base of the stone. It was a small gesture, a moment of quiet respect for a girl she had never known, but it was everything. It was the emotional echo, the lingering proof that Lily Carter was no longer forgotten. Her story had been woven back into the fabric of the town, a haunting reminder of the cost of truth and the enduring power of a single silenced voice that had, against all odds, finally been heard. The healing was bittersweet, the reflection haunting, but the silence had been broken forever. And in that, there was a kind of peace.